Hello, welcome to EVN Report. Joining me in the studio today is Nerses Kopalyan, the author of EVN Security Report. He is joining us to discuss the August security briefing. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Good to be here.
This month's security briefing was somewhat different in context, I would say. It's as we are approaching presidential elections in the United States, that will be very important not only for the United States but globally as well. We are here in Armenia from our vantage point also thinking about what a Kamala Harris administration might look like. And your August briefing was entitled, What Will Kamala Harris's Foreign Policy Look Like? An assessment of its implications on Armenia and the region. Now, you looked at the existing body of data to try and see what a potential Harris presidency's foreign policy would look like for Armenia and the South Caucasus. We know what Biden did. We know what a Trump presidency looked like. What is a Harris presidency going to look like if it happens?
Well, first, in order to be able to qualify what a Harris presidency would look like, first, it was kind of important to triangulate the existing data out there to understand what Harris's foreign policy doctrine would look like. And so, based on a conceptualization of a potential foreign policy doctrine as a foundational basis, upon that, we could make some assessments accordingly. So we need to shy away from sort of generic opinions on what things may look like, but try to more specifically ground them on existing body of information. In that context, there's been some talk that, yes, while the Trump administration was rather isolationist and relatively indifferent to developments in the South Caucasus, because in the hierarchy of priorities, the region was not very specific or important to the Trump foreign policy thinking. Biden's foreign policy was obviously more internationalist and engaging. But at the same time, we saw that a Biden foreign policy in general refrained from confrontation or escalatory behavior. In that context, whereas indeed the Biden administration was relatively more engaging in the South Caucasus, this was heavily diplomatic and not to the level needed for Armenia to address the severe problems that it was facing with respect to Azerbaijan and the security dilemma. So, kind of qualifying these two levels of information that we had, the assessment was what would a Harris foreign policy look like if elected? And the assumption or understanding that it would be a continuation of Biden's foreign policy is simply not true. Not true in the sense that there is really no precedent where an incoming either a vice president or a continuation of the presidency by the same political party has entailed a similar foreign policy orientation. Structurally, main things, of course, will remain. But as far as specific areas and specific characteristics of the doctrine and approaches and engagement on issues and policy areas, these tend to differ because each administration comes with its own specific policy priorities. And based on sort of a bit of a consensus from the international relations expert community that I looked at surveys, as well as looking at and triangulating Harris's foreign policy orientation, her voting in Senate, her speeches, her behavior as vice president, her advisors, and the group of people that basically make up her foreign policy thinking, we're able to reach a couple, a set of very general assessments. One was that similar to Biden and Obama, Harris will be quite engaging with respect to the international system and will seek to strengthen transnational international alliances, but do so more aggressively, using these systems to enhance and reinforce U.S. hegemony. So Harris would be a lot more involved in international institutions, engagements than the Biden administration. Not that the Biden administration was not, but Harris's administration, like the Obama administration to some extent, will be a lot more engaging. We saw that, and as I noted, whereas Biden's foreign policy doctrine sought to limit foreign confrontation and it refrained from escalatory posturing. We've seen this, for example, with China. We've seen actually to some extent with Russia. Harris would actually be a lot more confrontational and selectively escalatory on core issues that define her foreign policy priorities. There's just a lot of evidence on thinking and the people around her that suggest this would be the case. The third, as far as Harris' foreign policy doctrine would go, we see that Harris will be a lot more forceful with authoritarian allies and directly aggressive with non-allies or perceived enemies. Since for Harris, her team and the broader establishment that's going to be shaping her thinking, for them, the fight against authoritarianism sort of started at home against Trumpism. So, by extension and as prerogative, this will be extended also to the foreign policy stage. It would not be the defining component, but noting their orientation and modality of thinking, it is going to shape their approach to authoritarian or non-democratic regimes in a more confrontational fashion compared to what the Biden administration had.
Yeah, just two observations based on this. You also say that that Kamala Harris favors a hawkish human rights foreign policy, and Biden was much more courteous, if you will, to authoritarian leaders like Aliyev, as we saw. And another interesting point that you made, and just, for the sake of the conversation, female led states are more likely to forcefully escalate disputes than male led governments. Can you just expand on that? I know you're basing it on data and research, but it's also interesting. Why do you think that Kamala is going to be more hawkish? Why do you think she's going to be more like Obama? And that she will selectively escalate if necessary?
So, kind of two things to tap together. With respect to selective engagement, as I noted, this was from the Obama administration, and that Obama administration was very active on the warfare and foreign policy front. Most who don't study doesn't meet the eye, but the Obama administration used special forces and aerial bombings and advanced drone warfare more than any other president in recent history. In that context, it was a very active and confrontational foreign policy. And it would seek diplomacy first, but it would not shy away from using the stick if the care did not work in specific areas. Of course, it didn't always uphold the red lines that it set, but generally speaking, that was the policy orientation. Harris seems to lean towards that modality of thinking. And so, whereas Biden has shied away from extensively using special forces or advanced US technology for punitive action against countries or actors that have acted against US interests, Harris would be a lot more hawkish on this. And there's the degree of consensus from scholars that based on Harris's thinking and foreign policy orientation, she would be, proportionally speaking, uh, lot more. There would be a lot more probability of Harris using force to address human rights violations than in comparative terms to Biden or anyone prior to her in that context. So this is the hawkish element being utilized to qualify her posturing. With respect to female leaders or polities, as the research shows, polities that are led by women being a lot more confrontational during times of crises or during times of bargaining, which the report for August included as far as the large body of research is concerned on the subject matter. There are a few dimensions to this. One, we see there are a lot of examples from Golda Meir to Margaret Thatcher and so on and so forth that female leaders, one, tend to be a lot more robust in keeping and maintaining the strategic interests and the national security interests of their given country because there's a lot of potentially sort of a lashback or criticism against female leaders in the security sector, they tend to operate with sort of a chip on their shoulders. In that context, female leaders tend to be a lot more protective of national and security interests, and they do not shy away from confrontation. Two, in the domain of escalatory behavior, female leaders tend to be a lot more surgical and acute when trying to address a given issue. In that context, if in the hierarchy of their priority, it suggests that robust action is needed to address a certain issue, in that domain, they will, in effect, use force a lot more than male actors would, as far as probability is concerned. So this is what the large body of research has shown, and so understanding America's security environment, understanding the security establishment. Clearly, someone like Harris who comes in where there's going to be a lot of misogyny, a lot of criticism that female leaders are weak or incapable or incompetent. It is expected, aside from the research says, just purely observing the dynamics in the security establishment, U.S. politics, that she will, in effect, seek to display prowess and an ability to address and solve issues and crises because politically it's feasible to her. So, kind of triangulating these assessments is pretty. There's a bit of a consensus. Those who have studied this subject matter that she would be a lot more hawkish than meets the eye.
Mhm. Has there been, in the last 4 years of her vice presidency, has she made statements or taken positions that would lead one to believe that she would do that aside from do you know what I'm saying? I mean, standing here in Armenia, we didn't hear her being very vocal on global issues unless she was and we weren't aware of it.
So note that vice presidents always shy away from publicly engaging in subject matters that are specifically the domain of the president, right? The Bush administration was the exception because Dick Cheney, Vice President Cheney, dominated foreign policy because George W. Bush was considered to be a novice, whereas Joe Biden is a Cold War warrior with extensive foreign policy experience. So that was not an area that Kamala Harris was going to step into and publicly speak about. Now, with respect to internal conversations, and these will be revealed more down the line, for example, we knew that during the Obama administration, Biden and Obama disagreed a lot on foreign policy because Biden consistently cautioned restraint while Obama was more engaging. So, in due time, we'll see once this administration is over what the inside internal conversations were and the positions that Kamala took. But we know a few things from reporting. One, Kamala has been a lot more forceful in White House discussions about using force on issues of human rights violations, international law issues. That's been documented by journalists. Second, when we look at the group of advisors that Kamala Harris has surrounded herself in, they tend to be very different from Jake Sullivan and all the other security thinkers and sort of policymakers that Biden has surrounded himself with. So kind of triangulating those components, we could see where her orientation is. But clearly, if we're seeking to see direct examples of a vice president presenting their own foreign policy thinking or anything that diverges from that of the administration, that simply doesn't is not going to be there. And we know that, for example, Biden was very adamant in the Obama administration about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but Obama didn't do it. But we found this out later because the vice president is not going to come out and speak against their president. So in that context, the evidence or the empirical data we go off of is more specific, sort of the minutia of reporting that's coming out in these engagements, as well as understanding her broader orientation to triangulate her position.
Understood. Now, you also, and I want to quickly go through these outlined high probability outcomes with regard to the Russian Ukraine war, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. You said that, and this I found interesting, and I want to ask a question based on this, that she will be more forceful in her position in Ukraine. She will arm and support Ukraine more than Biden did, and any hesitancy by certain NATO members will be met with a strong response. Now, Turkey, as a NATO member, has been very careful in its position in the Ukraine Russia war. Do you think that Kamala will be able to come out and be more forceful in her relations with Turkey? Because this is important for the region as well.
So we've seen a few things in the last couple of months. Turkey has really slowed down its what was perceived to be tacit support for Russia, or sort of both sidism that the United States was very upset about. So Turkey has kind of on their end been very clever about it, not to push the envelope too much with the Americans. But whereas again, the Biden administration, approached Turkey with a bit of a softer understand let me rephrase myself, not so much softer, but less aggressive demands of Turkey being falling more in line with NATO demeanor, Harris would kind of escalate that a little more. In a sense, it took the Biden administration a little too long of tolerance for Turkey's both sidism until it brought Turkey back in line, or what may perceive right now temporarily being back in line with NATO demeanor. Harris would have been a lot more forceful from the start and be less tolerant of that kind of behavior. But more specifically, we could expect a more confrontational approach from the Harris administration with respect to Hungary, right? Hungary has become a big problem for the United States and the European Union. And quite honestly, Hungary has become a big problem for Armenia in the European Union. And even in the political sense, there's a lot of reporting going out that Orban and his government and his advisors have sort of, put together think tanks and conservative sort of groups in the United States to support the Trump candidacy. So aside from the foreign policy element, there's the conveyor belt of domestic policy affecting foreign policy is them definitely suggesting that the Harris administration is going to be very, very aggressive towards Orban's Hungary. Generally, sort of these illiberal leaders such as Orban, Erdogan tend to fall into the same parameters or clusters when it comes to foreign policy thinking in DC. So we can expect the the Harris administration to be a lot more aggressive on that front. Also, we understand that the Harris administration considers, Ukraine's relative success or the continuing weakening of Russia to be will be an important part of her foreign policy doctrine. Any actor that in any way mitigates the weakening of Russia or creates obstacles to the potential or tenable success of Ukraine would be tolerated much less by a Harris administration. In this context, to come back to your example, whatever Turkey had done that upset the Biden administration, any kind of behavior that comes close to that would face a lot harsher response from Harris. And everything that Orban has been doing to slow down EU assistance to the Ukrainians, et cetera, that'll also face a lot of severe blowback from a Harris administration. And so, contextually, as far as the Russo-Ukrainian war is concerned, not only can we expect more assistance from the United States, but also a lot of these sort of the restraint that the Biden administration has placed on the Ukrainians themselves with respect to the use of American weaponry in the conflict. I think we can expect the Biden administration to remove the Harris administration to remove those restraints.
Okay, you also talk about Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip over Georgia, although that is, again, very important as they head into elections in October. But with regard to Azerbaijan, you talk about a Eastern pivot and this Russo-Azerbaijani access to maintain the region's authoritarian orbit will be viewed as a direct threat to the United States and to Euro-Atlantic interests in the region. And again, as I said earlier, you had written here that Biden was overly courteous when it came to authoritarianism or authoritarian leaders. How is this going to play out, do you think? Do you think that Harris will go and use that option of sanctions if she sees that Azerbaijan, let's say, attacks sovereign Armenia once again?
So let's kind of do a comparative assessment. The Biden administration said we're not going to sanction Azerbaijan unless they egregiously violate our red lines, which is a full-blown invasion of Armenia. But at the same time, the Biden administration said we are going to support Armenia's resiliency. We're going to enhance military engagements. We're going to strengthen Armenia so that the power asymmetry gap will be closed, and therefore Armenia would have more deterrence capabilities. So again, the Biden administration's approach wasn't one of confrontation against Aliyev and escalating tensions with Aliyev when Aliyev sort of engaged in the behavior that he did, but their approach was tacit and continuous diplomatic pressure on Baku while methodically attempting to strengthen and develop Yerevan's capabilities. And as far as the Harris administration, the approach might be similar, but it would be enhanced and a lot more intensified in that context. So the amount of soft or tacit pressure that the Biden administration placed on Baku to limit their behavior, the Harris administration will be a lot more direct and confrontational when the Aliyev regime engages in behavior that the U.S. finds problematic. So it would be less tolerant because, surprisingly or not surprisingly, the Biden administration has been a lot more tolerant than one would have expected. So this is what I mean when I say the her approach would be a little different. At the same time, indeed, while we've been talking about why the Biden's administration support for Armenia has been relatively slower than anticipated, we can expect a more robust speed with respect to strengthening Armenia's capabilities and enhancing the strategic partnership, so on and so forth, from a Harris administration. So the point here isn't that the Harris administration is going to be the savior and that Harris's foreign policy doctrine is going to come and solve all of Armenia's security problems. No. But the difference is going to be in that Baku would have to reconfigure its behavior because if it had calculated that certain modalities of behavior, egregious behavior, gives them flexibility with Biden because the Biden administration is a lot more tolerable. That flexibility, that leeway, might not or will not exist with the Harris administration. Therefore, their behavior would be a lot more restrained. So this is basically what we're talking about in that context.
Well, especially that Aliyev is supporting Trump, I think this will also play into
Yeah,
perhaps
yes,
deterioration of
Ollie made a
relations. Yeah.
big mistake there because when he made that statement, most were basically accepting it as a foregone conclusion because during that period, the race was between Trump and Trump was looking quite good in the polls. So Ollie made that statement because during that period, the issue of Biden dropping out was not even a subject of serious conversation. So he did make a serious strategic mistake in that sense. And as I note in the report, a Harris Walz administration is not going to take that lightly. That's not something that's going to basically escape, their consideration.
And I do have to raise the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. You state that Harris, like others, will unlikely revisit the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. Do you think this would hold true? I mean, I would assume that this holds true with Trump, but this would also hold true with Harris because for them the issue is now what, resolved?
Correct. So with Trump, just in comparative terms, relations with Azerbaijan will not continue deteriorating, right? So relations between the United States and Azerbaijan have deteriorated. They're not broken, but they're not what they used to be. And Ali implemented this and even complained about the Biden administration as working against Azerbaijan's interests. So clearly, a Trump administration, which would be a throwback to his first administration, the isolationist hands-off approach is something that Baku would prefer. Therefore, Baku's interests are more aligned with that. Now, as far as Harris goes, as far as Harris, Azerbaijan, and the Artsakh issue, these are all interconnected. As I addressed, by virtue of what a Harris doctrine would look like, relations with Armenia, with United States and Azerbaijan will continue to deteriorate. They will not fully break, of course, but an authoritarian regime that maintains or seeks to maintain a Russo-Azerbaijani orbit and more so continues to attack a nascent democracy is not something that is going to be taken lightly or tolerated by a Harris administration. But again, the degree of response we cannot gauge, but it clearly is not going to be as tolerant as Biden's. So the deterioration of U.S. Azerbaijani relations is expected, especially as I note in the report, the continuous pivot that Azerbaijan is making towards the east and generally speaking, it's anti-American posturing or diatribes that's coming out of Aliyev. But that does not mean that just because U.S. Azerbaijan relations will deteriorate, that would translate into the Biden administration, I'm sorry, the Harris administration, the post-Biden administration reviving the Artsakh issue. For any incoming administration, the US foreign policy and security establishment since the early 1990s has taken the position, and this is an institutionalized posture that is not going to change, that the solution of the Artsakh conundrum is in America's strategic interest. Now, the way that this conundrum was solved, it was definitely heartbreaking and catastrophic for Armenia, for us. And while the US might agree that this was terrible and catastrophic, they're not going to agree that whatever it was that led to this catastrophe needs to be reopened and readdressed. In that context, they are not going to relitigate the 2020 war or the 2023 ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, they are going to obviously address these issues that come through the lens of refugee crisis, human rights violations, economic support, etc., etc., etc. But at the level of geopolitical configurations, at the level of US policy, it would be intellectually dishonest of anyone to say that any US administration, whether it's a Trump or a Harris administration, is going to reopen the Artsakh issue. In that context, this issue from the lens of the United States is resolved. And so a Harris administration, like as I noted, will take positions and policies in the South Caucasus that will very likely clash and create problems with Baku. But that is not going to translate in any changes to the US position with respect to Artsakh.
This is important for Yerevan and for Armenians to realize moving forward on how we view the Artsakh issue, but that's a conversation for another time. In its totality, you write that the Harris administration's overarching policy approach to Armenia will be defined by three pillars. Can you, so that we wrap up our conversation, just talk about those three main pillars?
Yes.
And again, this is, sorry
Mhm.
to interrupt, but this is again, this is based on triangulation, as you
Right.
often use of information, but interesting and important for us to know.
Right. So, for example, the first pillar I note would be enhancing Armenia's resiliency. So, the foundations are there from the Biden administration enhancing Armenia's resiliency. But the Biden administration has been very adamant that this will primarily have a soft power component. Uh, Based on the triangulation, my point is that a Harris administration, one of its pillars would be indeed continuing the enhancing of Armenia's resilience, but it would not be specific to soft power, but rather it would include hard power components. And in last month's briefing, we spoke about American, defense diplomacy, and a continuation of defense diplomacy or deepening of it entails hard power capabilities. And so, triangulating and basing it on that continuous institutional process, we can make the point or the argument that indeed enhancing resiliency is going to continue. And as American defense diplomacy and its strategic partnership deepens with Armenia, this, by virtue of that process, is going to entail hard power components. And so we will very likely go from a soft power resiliency modeling to one that is enhanced to include hard power components. And that is an important change as far as Armenia is concerned. The second pillar is supporting democratic institutionalization and consolidation in Armenia. The Biden administration, through USAID and the Office of OTI Transitional Initiative, has implemented some programs on this, but its approach has not been very holistic and as aggressive. The Harris administration, based again on the existing assessments, would be a lot more supportive and would provide a lot more funding and technical and direct engagement to speed up and strengthen Armenia's democratic institutionalization. And the third pillar, again, would be somewhat similar to what we have with the Biden administration, but again, on a lot more enhanced basis. And that is providing diplomatic cover and support to Armenia against its predatory neighbors. So, conceptually, right, at the macro level, as I said, the differences aren't going to be too much, right, at the macro or structural level. But then all the nuances and sort of, the characteristics that make up the macro components, these are the defining features. And we can expect a lot more engaged, a lot more involved, and a lot more attentive Harris administration with respect to the South Caucasus. And this is going to contradict Azerbaijan's interests because they want less of a transatlantic presence, but would align with Armenia's interest because Armenia wants a bigger transatlantic presence in the region.
Do I dare ask about what a Trump presidency would look like? Should we expect more of the same from his previous administration, where, as you noted at the top, was more isolationist and detrimental. I mean, negatively impacted our region for sure.
So the report obviously hasn't done a profiling of a Trump administration, because there's sufficient data to be able to gauge that a lot more clearly. But if we're going to go off of developments from 2016 to 2020, understanding the preferences of the Aliyev regime, understanding, and we've talked about this extensively, the implications for the Russo-Ukraine war, and the fact that Trump administration would clearly free up Russian resources, allowing Russia to reestablish itself, and therefore turn its attention to its previous, what it considers to be its peripheries. The dynamics would completely change. But in more simple terms, a Trump administration would entail lesser of a Euro transatlantic presence in the region, which aligns with Russo-Azerbaijani interests, and therefore harms or is counterproductive to Armenia's interests. And this isn't directed towards Armenia. This is primarily what Trump's foreign policy doctrine entails. And in that context, all the remaining residual consequences will be a byproduct of that broader vision that his administration will have of the region.
Well, as always, Nerses, thank you for this interesting conversation and for shedding light on the August EVN security report. And thank you to our listeners for joining us.
Thank you for having me.